Now, Dr. Schwartz told me about 45 minutes would be about right. I could talk for hours and hours, but I don't want to do that because I know that'll put you to sleep. But as I'm going through a lot of material, I will skim over things just for the sake of saving time. But if you see on a slide that I zip through something that you really would like to hear more about, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. Otherwise, hang on to questions until the end. So, as Dr. Schwartz said, the topic is the evidence of Eastern influence in early Irish Christianity. Now, nope, stick to the script, Connie, or you'll never get over. Questions I'm going to answer. Were there Christians in Ireland before St. Patrick? Who were they? What evidence do we have of them? And was there such a thing as a Celtic church? That's a phrase that you hear somewhat. By the end of the talk, you should be able to tell me what's wrong with this picture. Okay. An essential context you need to have, which is, remember, we're talking now about 4th century. Things you need to know to keep everything in perspective. Remember that the church was born speaking Greek. Syrian, Alexandrian, Persian, Byzantine families of liturgy all preceded the Roman liturgy. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Did you know there were 11 Greek and Syrian popes before the year 753? All that is important because it sets the context, what we're dealing with. Be aware that Alexandria, Egypt, was the first center of Christian theology and the birthplace of monasticism as well. Until the post-Reformation period, Ireland was quite orthodox in faith, but it was unique in practice in many respects. To the extent that we can discover it, to the extent that there are records left, Ireland's liturgy was based upon that of Gaul, sometimes called the Gallican liturgy, whose origins were, according to the people who defended it in the 8th century liturgy wars, Rome, Alexandria, Ephesus, and Jerusalem. Monasteries, not dioceses, were the defining feature of Catholic life in Ireland. I also want you to begin by dispelling the notion you may have picked up from popular culture that Ireland was an insignificant little backwater that was isolated from the mainstream of Western civilization. That notion was created by English historians whose intention is to disparage Ireland and its people. The fact is that Ireland was a full participant in European culture and science up until the Norman invasion of 1179. Ireland, in the Irish language, Gaeilge, has the oldest vernacular literature in Europe, which is to say in the world. So don't fall for the trap of disparaging old Ireland. It's not just a cozy place of leprechauns. History and archaeology document that Ireland was known in the Mediterranean world. Ptolemy mentions it, etc. I'll skip over that. In the 1950s, discovery was made of Egyptian beads in tombs at Tara. Egyptian beads that came from about 1350 BC. So clearly there was a lot of traffic going on. You know, I think about the Celts. You've heard about the Celts. This was the spread of the Celtic at their height. Okay, that doesn't come on. It's not visible. That's the problem. Okay, that was the spread of the Celtic Empire. It wasn't actually an empire. It was a collection of tribes, but that was the area they covered. Today, it's reduced to this. And this, by the way, is Galatia. Think of the epistle to the Galatians. They were behaving like Irishmen, right, if you read the epistles? The dark green areas, the darkest green. Will the recording pick me up if I walk over there? The darkest green areas are where the language persists. That's the Celtic fringe, they call it now. Welcome. Celts came probably from 700 BC. The last wave was about 100 BC. Those were the Gaels. They practiced Druidism. Don't need to say much about that, except that it was real. It was interesting, some of the features of the Druidic religion. They believed in multiple deities. They loved things in triplicate. Three this, three that, three the other. Interesting. They believed in praying. They believed in chanting. They believed in eternal life. They were really fond of horses and birds. They had their important places, and they had their seasonal feasts, most of which are now saints' days. But in some way, those kind of, you might say, prepared for Christianity, because they were familiar with this. You may be familiar with this statue, very famous statue, sometimes called the Dying Gaul, or the Dying Galatian, or the Dying Gladiator. It's in the Capitoline Museum in Rome. You can tell by the, oh, come on, computer, don't do that to me, by the torque around his neck that he was Celtic nobility. The torque is it's sort of like metal braided together with little knobs at the end. And you can look, if you see very closely, you can see it. But that was always a mark of Celtic nobility. The Celts, the Druids they were the learned class, priests, teachers, and judges. They did not believe in writing, therefore they memorized everything. It took 15 years of memory work to be considered a poet. So there's a lot of stuff that you had to know, and it was memorized. How do we know about the Celts? There are the sources, I think you can see, the Roman historians, and those totally corroborate with the ancient Irish sagas. And perhaps the reluctance to fight more Celts was the reason that Tacitus decided not to invade Ireland, even though he was told, hey, all we need is one legion and we can do it. But he decided not to invade Ireland, and that made all the difference, didn't it? Because because it made Ireland Ireland, it allowed the Gaelic civilization to thrive and to be itself. Everywhere else the Romans went, the native culture vanished in due time. In Ireland, it remained the Celtic Gaelic civilization, and that made Ireland Ireland, and everything that follows from that, down to the modern day. Now, as Christianity was accepted, and realized that took centuries, it was a gradual, bloodless conversion. Druids lost their priestly functions, but they continued to be the masters of the culture. As poets, historians, genealogists, judges, doctors, they continued under Christianity to be at the top of society as monks, priests, and abbots. They just transitioned right over. Some, not all, of course. Poets, talked about poets, okay. Now, on to the faith. The faith came to Ireland, I hate to say this, Irishmen, you don't want to hear it, but it came by way of Britain, most likely, the first faith. Tertullian in 208 had said that there are places among the Britons unapproached by the Romans, but subdued to Christ. Well, if you know anything about British history, you remember there was Hadrian's Wall, and there was Wales, and the Romans never really got to Wales or northern Scotland, so those may be the places he was referring to. But then Chrysostom in 387 in Antioch wrote that even outside our world, the very British islands beyond this sea have felt the power of the word as testified by the churches and altars they have erected. Notice he says British islands, plural. Interesting. But that map is a fairly good illustration of how the traffic would have gone. The green line, of course, is how they got from Alexandria up. Now, something to mention about Gaul, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but Gaul, of course, modern-day France. You may have heard France called the oldest or earliest or first daughter of the church, and that's because of this very, very close line of connection. Gaul was evangelized by St. Irenaeus. St. Irenaeus was evangelized by St. Polycarp, and he sat at the feet of St. John the Evangelist. So that's almost living memory for the first influence of Christianity in Gaul. In 410, Honoratus founded a monastery on this small island, the smaller of those two islands, using the rule of St. Pachomius of Egypt. St. Pachomius was one of the early monastic leaders. A couple of years later, St. John Cassian, who is considered the founder of monasticism, founded a monastery near Marseille, not too far away, after he and 300 other monks had fled from Alexandria. Tradition says that St. Patrick, studied at Lerins after he escaped slavery. He doesn't say that, not provable, but that's the tradition. So why were these folks leaving Egypt? What was going on in Egypt? Well, Egyptian Christians had gone into the caves since the persecution of Decius in 249. After Christianity was legal, they still went into the caves. Thousands more, in fact, fled the world and all its busyness because they wanted to save their souls. They wanted to get away from the world. They believed the end of the world was coming any day now, and they wanted to make sure they were ready to face it. There also were problems for Christians in Alexandria. The Egyptian church never accepted the Council of Chalcedon. So if you believed that Jesus was truly God and truly man, and that Mary was his mother, you were in deep yogurt. And so there were lots of reasons to get out of Dodge. And monks wanted solitude and peace and quiet. So in 1910, there was a collection made of all the old Gaelic names of every place in Ireland. And there were 500 places that had the name Desert or desert in the name, which, now, desert did not mean dry, it meant isolated. So those may well be places where solitary monks had their cells. And it's not at all out of character that they would go. There are no passports from the 4th century, of course, but there is evidence of Mediterranean influence. We're going to look for it in architecture, stone slabs, church decoration, customs, high crosses, and manuscripts. And I'm going to go a mile a minute, so if I talk too fast and you can't understand me, please wave at me. And I'm going to skim through a lot of these slides. There's a manuscript in the Royal Irish Academy to guide Irish pilgrims to Scetis in the Nitrian Valley of Egypt, an area famous for its monasteries. So even after Christianity, the Irish were on the monastic trail. The life of the Desert Fathers was written by Athanasius, the life of St. Anthony of Egypt. And it was like the bestseller of its day. It covered the known world. And the flood to monasticism was huge. Architecture. You see in the middle the huts at Skellig Michael, where Luke Skywalker visited not too long ago. On the bottom left is Glendalough in County Wicklow, St. Kevin's. And then the above is another ruin. Something that is noticeable about these is they were very small churches. They tended to be built in groups of 7, just as in the Egyptian desert. And even among buildings that were built of wood, archaeology now can find traces. The design is almost identical to churches in Syria and North Africa. The top is a picture of Skellig Michael. The bottom is a church in Syria, in North Africa. Same architecture, beehive huts. Dry stone construction, no mortar. Solitary monks tended to attract followers, so solitaries became abbots. Monasteries grew. Now, there is no evidence that the solitary monks tried to evangelize the pagans. I'm not taking anything away from good St. Patrick. Full credit to Patrick for evangelization. Uam, I don't know if you've ever heard of Uam writing. It's a script. Remember I told you that the Celts didn't write, but Uam was the beginning of a language. On stones that you can see, they're vertical stones. There's a good picture there if you can see it. Horizontal lines were drawn. They meant something, the order in which they were and the order, the length, etc. It was over by the 4th century. It may go back to the 1st century, does. But if you're driving along a little road outside of the city of Cork to a town of Agabalog, going along the road, you'll see this little stop, and that roundy thing is a holy well. There are about 3,000 holy wells in Ireland, and most of them have the names of saints. If you look at the standing stone, you will see a standing stone with written on it, and scholars agree that this probably predates Patrick by at least a century. And a Rosetta Stone for was discovered, and so we know what it says, and here's what it says. Pray for St. Olin the Egyptian. Who was St. Olin? Who knows? Probably a holy man who impressed the locals with his sanctity. Maybe he performed a miracle or two. We just don't know. But that's his holy well, and that's his stone, and it's been there a long time. And if people didn't believe in him, they would have taken that down. Here's a holy well, too. This is St. Bridget's holy well. This is all that's left of St. Bridget's Monastery in Kildare, which at one point included thousands of people. Now, it also included something else interesting. And Cogitosus, who wrote the Vitae Sanctae Brigidae in 650, described it as the church was adorned with painted pictures, and the party wall within it, defining the sanctuary, was decorated and painted with figures. Well, now, if you put that into contemporary English, what is a party wall between the sanctuary and the people except an icon screen, or an iconostasis in Eastern Church language? But that's not the only instance. Here in Leicestershire, England, there is a church called Bredon-on-Hill. Now, by the 7th century, Irish monks were evangelizing the Anglo-Saxons. So, of course, they brought with them all their customs and everything. Now, the church, if you look at the church there in the left-hand corner, you see a Normanish tower. On the right, you see a picture of the internal part of the church, which is very Gothic. But if you go to the oldest part of the church, look what you find. Carved icon screen. Byzantine-style iconostasis with Virgin and Apostles, architectural friezes inscribed with Syrian lion hunts and centaurs and workers in the vineyard. There weren't too many vineyards in England in the 6th and 7th century. Okay, so there's another piece of evidence. Now, let's look at the Irish High Cross. Beautiful one on the wall there. What could be more Irish than the High Cross and the Book of Kells? Well, let's take a closer look. Bear in mind that after the fall of Rome, there were no monuments put up in anywhere in Western Europe, except in Ireland. Okay, so we know what those were. This is a cross in Aheny, County Tipperary. There are 2 of them. There used to be 3. The ruins of what are still there. At the bottom of this is the east cross, no, sorry, the south, the north cross. This is the south side of the base of the north cross. And you can't really see it very well in this picture, but on the farthest left, there is a solitary monk sitting under a palm tree. Palm trees don't grow in Ireland. Where did he get that idea? Other art on high crosses, and this was an early one. You see how simple it was. Miradox there at Clonmacnoise, which on the wall, much more complicated. This was an early one. But as they went on, reaching their peak in the 7th century, many of them had this design. This is the orange posture of prayer, which goes back to the catacombs. Desert saints were a lot of the decorations on the high crosses. The Crux Gemata, which was Constantine, after the discovery of the Holy Cross, had created a beautiful cross with stones circling it, precious stones circling the juncture of the arms. And another interesting thing, the Osiris pose of Christ. If you know anything about the pyramids, in the pyramids in Egyptian art, Osiris, who was the main god, is pictured with his arms folded, holding a flail and something else in his two hands. That's a very Egyptian pose. It's on some of the high crosses being Christ. Artists did what they knew how to do, what they had been told. Another thing, in the high crosses, Christ is shown clothed. Now that's not from Rome. The Romans loved nudity, and there was nudity in the saints and even in the early pictures of Christ at this period. But the Syrians did not like nudity, and the Syrians had banned nudity in icons and paintings in about late 5th, early 6th century. So the high crosses in Ireland did not have nudity. Okay, nothing else anywhere in Christendom like these crosses, except in Armenia. Armenia? Now, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, the Ireland's great epic, her Iliad it's called, references Armenia. Now, when the Táin was written down, which could be, well, it was written down in the 8th century, but it's probably been told since about the 1st century, and it would have been written down faithfully. They knew about Armenia. Armenia was everywhere. Subjects on Armenian monuments occur in the same way on Irish high crosses. The South Cross of Castledermot in County Kildare has exactly the same treatment of apostles as on the west face of a basilica at Odzun in Armenia. Okay? But now what about that distinctive juncture at the cross, at the crossing of the two arms? Well, where did that come from? Well, it took the medievalists and art historians to figure that one out. Helen Rowe, who was a medievalist and the first woman president of the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland, she traced that back to pilgrim souvenirs from Jerusalem in the 3rd and 4th century. Françoise Henry, who was a French woman who came to Ireland in the 1930s to study art and became the greatest advocate of Irish art and greatest scholar of Irish art, she acknowledged a similar ancestry between the Irish High Cross and crosses in Georgia, Svanitsia in northwest Georgia, and Armenia. And then in 1985, Hilary Richardson, who was the Royal Irish Academy's first exchange scholar with the Soviet Union, studied archaeology in the Caucasus Mountains. And she found a common denominator between the Celtic cross and the Armenian votive stelae from the 5th through the 7th centuries. And this is getting into art history. I don't want to bore you, but I'll keep going quickly. Rowe traced the ornamentation on high crosses from Constantine's Crux Gemata by way of jeweled styroteca shown on a slab in Drumshala in Ireland and on the Church of the Anastasis, which is the church built above the Holy Sepulchre, which appeared on the Palestinian pilgrims' souvenirs. Massive quadrangular base with 2 or more steps, which represents the ascent to Golgotha, the running decoration of the ring arcs, the last reminiscence of the star-filled cosmos. Okay, that's how she explained it. And then Helen Rowe knew there had to be other connections. And then just before she died, this was found. It's a textile from Egypt in the 5th century. Is that a perfect Celtic cross or not? From Egypt in the 5th century. The textile was acquired by the Minneapolis Institute of Art as part of a collection of, random ancient fabrics. But it is the first and oldest example of a large Latin cross. Latin means just come on, computer. Just means 2 bars rather than the 3 bars. Oh, come on, computer, come back to me. Okay. And this, she knew it had to be there, and just before she died, it was found. Okay. So that's art and texture. Gaelic literature. As I mentioned, it's the third oldest vernacular literature in Europe. Beginning in the 6th century, Christian monks developed Sean Gaeilge, Old Irish, and they composed hymns and prayers in it and wrote down the ancient tales. In 1179, the Normans banned the use of the Irish language, and literature moved to the west, and the areas not included in the Norman Pale around Dublin. By the 18th century, of course, Gaelic aristocracy and literature was dead. But go back to how books were protected in the ancient world. Here is a slab at St. Vigan's in Aberloth in northeast Scotland. Now, this would have been Pict country, but remember, the Irish monks evangelized the Picts from a home base of Lindisfarne. The slab to the right, this is the only picture I could find of it, I'm sorry it's not very good, shows monks carrying book satchels. Now, book satchels are not unlike the backpacks of the 4th century, just leather, folded together like a basic pouch. They were the way of carrying books. Strap around the neck. In the 19th century, Frederick Warren, who was an Episcopalian scholar, he was a clergyman actually, he compared the leather satchel of an Ethiopic manuscript to the leather satchel of an Irish missal in the Oxford Museum and wrote, "The two resemble each other so closely in texture and design that they might be thought to have come from the same workshop." And indeed, maybe the skills did come from the same. Both Egypt and Ireland made book shrines, and book shrines, after you had the leather thing for carrying it around, book shrines were the next step up. Egypt and Ireland both made book shrines. The oldest one dates, guess where it can be found? Cairo Museum. They've been found on Armenian books, Coptic books, Ottoman books, and Irish books. Here is a picture of the book shrine of the Cathach of Columcille. You can see how they would offer protection. They were metal, bronze, beautifully sculpted, beautifully engraved, carved. Obviously, you only did this if you had a lot of money. So if you were a bishop or abbot of a really large and successful monastery. I mentioned the Cathach. That's Cathach, the Cathach of St. Columcille. It is the oldest surviving manuscript in Ireland. It is the second oldest Latin Psalter in the world, Book of Psalms. It is decorated with red dots, peacocks, dolphins, as were Egyptian manuscripts. So the art of writing crossed boundaries. Sideline of history, it survived because it was taken out of Ireland and didn't return, taken out in 1691. Only 58 out of 110 pages survive. It's in the Royal Irish Academy. If you ever get to Dublin, you can look at it. It means battler. Ca means battle in Irish. It was sometimes carried into battle at the front of the army. Guess what? In Armenia, gospel books were also carried into battle, hopefully in a book satchel or a cave. Okay. Decorated and illuminated manuscripts are what would have been kept in the book shrines. The difference between decoration and illumination, decoration means art, illumination means there's gold in the art. Most famous are the books of Kells and so forth. Another interesting feature of early Irish manuscripts, they have colophons, which are little inscriptions at the very end of the manuscript saying this was made by so-and-so on such and such a date, paid for by so-and-so. They say it nicer than that, but it's vital information. And that, of course, is a very important way of tracing who had money and was commissioning books throughout history. Only 10 manuscripts older than the year 1000 have survived on Irish soil, but that's another subject. Now, Where did the Irish get the idea to illuminate manuscripts? Well, the oldest illuminated manuscripts in the world are the Garima Gospels of Ethiopia, which is just south of Egypt. They were illuminated in the 4th century. Ethiopia accepted Christianity at 330. Book of Kells was written in 800 or thereabouts. Now here are pictures of the Garima Gospel, one page, right next to a picture from the Book of Kells. See any similarities? And then on the next page is an Armenian manuscript and the familiar canon table of the St. John the Evangelist Library across the campus. So tradition spreads. Who wrote the manuscripts? This is a map of some of the major monasteries. There were about 250 monasteries. Probably 3,000 manuscripts have been lost. This is the beautiful countryside of Kells, the remains of the monastery of Kells. You're all familiar with the Book of Kells. If you're not, go check it out in the library because there are beautiful books in there on the Book of Kells. This is the 4 evangelists. Here are some other pages. And then I want to focus on this page, sometimes called the Madonna, the Virgin enthroned. Now, when you look at that, you think, well, that looks kind of weird. But that is the classic Hodegetria pose of Greek iconography. The Mother of God sitting there with the baby on her lap, the baby's on her left side, she's pointing to the baby with her right hand, telling the world, you know, follow him, he's important. What she's wearing in the Book of Kells is the attire that an Irish queen would wear in those days, except for the brooch. An Irish queen would wear the brooch on the left shoulder. But here it's on the right shoulder, as it was worn in the East. And there we have side by side the Kells Madonna and a sample Hodegetria. Oh, I'm 30 minutes. I got 15 more minutes. Oh, God. Okay. Okay. So the conclusion of art experts was this. The relation between Irish and Hiberno-Saxon illuminations and Mediterranean art, including early Christian, Byzantine, and Coptic paintings, carvings, and textiles, is at best tenuous. Like I said, no passports from the 4th century. Certain iconographic parallels, however, suggest no other plausible explanation. There is no other way to explain this except if the same artists came from one place to Ireland. One day in 2006, a man was digging peat in County Tipperary. Now, if you know anything about digging peat, it usually comes up in very even bricks. This comes up, he says, that's unusual. He could just make out the words in Valle Lacrimarium, in the Valley of Tears. This turned out to be the first vellum manuscript to be discovered in 200 years. Probably dates to the 7th or 8th century. All the manuscripts at that point in time were made from vellum, calf skin. So when you realize what a rough, uneven surface these monks were painting on, you get more appreciation of their art. It's known as the Fat and More Psalter, and you can see it. This is a picture of a page and letters that floated off the page. Being buried in a bog, there's no oxygen, so things don't decay like they would elsewhere. In order to find a book that had been constructed in the same way as this, the conservators had to go to the Cairo Museum. And the Nag Hammadi manuscripts from 4th century Christians in Egypt were made in the same way. And it gets better. Inside the leather cover was lined with papyrus from Egypt. So, does this prove that there were Egyptian Christians in Ireland? Well, no, it's kind of circumstantial evidence, I suppose you'd say. But it is tangible evidence that the Egyptian art of bookmaking and satchel making, oh yeah, because the book was in a satchel, was known in Ireland, and that there was a lot of traffic between Ireland and Egypt. And further evidence is from other manuscripts, and here I'm really going to go fast. Okay, the Stowe Missal, in Latin and Old Irish, 8th century. The litany of this missal includes prayers for the emperor and the Roman army. It also had a book shrine. Bit of a side trip. It was written in probably the 8th century, and then it disappeared. But it was found again in the 18th century when a British landlord was doing renovations on his castle, and he knocked down a wall, and hidden in the wall was this book shrine, this missal, and a crozier. We don't know who the crozier belonged to, but the Stowe Missal now belongs to the people of Ireland. Irish monasteries, that's where, in these manuscripts, is where you find the rules of monasteries. I'm not going to take the time to go over all of them, but I do want to mention a couple similarities of interest. First, the Orans posture of prayer. We talked about that. That is still standard in the Eastern Church. No kneeling during the Paschal season or on Sundays was allowed in some of these rules. That's still the tradition in the East. The prayer postures were always considered weirdly Irish. The cross-figgle. You've heard the story of St. Kevin, who stood praying with his arms outstretched until a wren came and built a nest in his hand, one of the legend of St. Kevin. That's the cross-figgle position, and that's how people prayed. And if you were doing penance, you stood in a barrel of cold water and did that while you recited the 350s. What are the 350s? 150 Psalms, which you would have learned by memory if you were a monk. Now, oh, those Irish were weird. Yeah, but guess what? They got it from Egypt because that's part of the rule of St. Pachomius. Prostrations, not timid little genuflections, prostrations, both knees and forehead on the floor. For a penance, you would do it 100 times in some of these books, in the penitentials. Communion was distributed with a spoon. We know that from archaeological finds and also by reading closely the text of this. The use of eulogia. Eulogia is called in Eastern churches today antediron. It's the holy bread. A loaf of bread is baked and brought to the altar. The central part is cut out, and that becomes the Eucharist. The rest of it becomes eulogia or antediron, and that's distributed to the people afterwards. Well, in the Vita Columbae, which is the life of St. Columcille, there are several instances where that was used with miraculous effect. Columbanus quotes St. Basil in a sermon. Saturday was the day of rest. Sunday was the day of worship. Worship was not considered rest. Antiphonal singing was in use in the Irish monasteries before the 7th century, as in Egypt. Daily private mass was unknown. You had to have a congregation there to celebrate the divine liturgy. Baptism was done by triple immersion with communion and chrismation, aka confirmation, immediately thereafter. It is documented that even as late as the 16th century, baptized infants in Ireland could receive a drop of the precious blood on their lips. Obviously, that caused problems with Rome, right? Celtic priests wore epimanica, cuffs at their wrists, like Byzantine priests do today. So these old traditions were alive and well in early Ireland. More evidence. Oh, yes, okay, Litany of Angus of Tallaght, written around 800. Now, remember, monasteries were the most conservative places on the planet. They never changed anything. They did what was handed down from their founders. They didn't want to change anything for fear of falling into error, right? Because they were just imitating what they had gotten from before them. Now, Angus wrote this litany was first written down, I should say, sometime around 799, was first published in English in 1867. It had been copied from a manuscript found in St. Isidore's in Rome. Now, St. Isidore's is the Franciscan College in Rome. The Franciscan College at Louvain was where Irish Catholics went to study and become priests during the penal days, during the Reformation persecutions. And then St. Isidore's is where all the manuscripts were transferred to when Napoleon started making chaos in Brussels. Okay, so that's, it came from the Lauer Languedoc, the Book of Leinster, which was compiled in 1160 from much older material. In that litany, there is a prayer. I invoke unto my aid, through Jesus Christ, 7 Egyptian monks in desert Italy. In other words, he was praying, he's asking the intercession of 7 Egyptian monks who were buried in desert Italy. Now, we don't know where desert Italy was, but there may have been a community of Egyptian monks there. The Litany of Irish Saints, published a little bit later, includes references to Karui from Armenia, who was a bishop of Kilaki. That's how you spell Kilaki, those of you who know the Kilaki brothers. Other things, other textual evidence. Abgatir Chraibad, the Alphabet of Piety, written in Old Irish, possibly as early as 600. It's a paraphrase of St. John Keshin's conferences. Marian devotion in Ireland began very early. Didn't get going in the rest of Europe for centuries, but it started in Jerusalem in the east. The Childhood Deeds of Jesus, a surviving manuscript in Old Irish verse, probably originated in Greece or Syria in the 2nd century, draws on the Gospel of Thomas. Psalter Naran, which is a 10th century surviving manuscript. The Psalms in Irish poetry. It has sections taken directly from Egyptian texts. But it wasn't translated or published until 1976, so older scholarship wouldn't have known this. Bangor, County Down, huge, wonderful monastery. That's where St. Columbanus and St. Kilian probably came from, who went to Clonmacnoise. The Bangor was a real center of scholarship. Between 602 and 691, and you can date it based upon who's invoked and who's mentioned, compiled what's now known as the Antiphonary of Bangor. This was discovered at St. Columbanus's monastery in Bobbio, modern-day Italy, in 1609, brought to Milan when there was war and chaos in Italy, shoved into a closet, and left there for another 200 years. And so it finally got into English in 1881. Monks, remember, wrote down and taught what their predecessors had said. And this is what Bangor, the great monastery at Bangor, said about itself. House full of delight, built on the rock, and indeed the true vine transplanted from Egypt. They considered the ancestors of their monastery to be Egypt. And here's a page of the document itself. In 1970, Father Joseph Crehan, a liturgical and scripture scholar, found word-for-word parallels between the Antiphonary of Bangor and the Coptic Book of the Hours. Very quickly, liturgy. The pre-Norman liturgy in Ireland was primarily Gallican. The Gallican liturgy, if you know anything about liturgy, had many Eastern elements in it. We know that from the sources. This is how it would tell us what the Mass was. There was no creed. Well, the Antiphonary of Bangor has a creed that is different from any other text known to exist in any manuscript anywhere. It's the original creed of Nicaea. Obviously, it doesn't have the filioque, but it states the homoousia of the 3 persons. There was no creed at all in the Roman Rite until the 11th century. But guess what? There was one in Constantinople in the 5th century. So, last question, was there a Celtic church? A lot of people who are in the semi-New Age stuff say, oh, yeah, there was a Celtic church. People were discovering their true self, and they were connecting with nature, and, all this. If by Celtic church you mean there was a church whose origins were only a few generations from Christ Jesus, and which was faithful to his teachings, but happened to be in Ireland, yes, it was a Celtic church. It had spiritual roots in the monasticism of ancient Egypt, which was apostolic to the core. It had a diversity of rites. By virtue of its isolation from the Roman administration, it absorbed the Gaelic culture and developed and followed unique customs that, of course, were different from what was developing on continental Europe. Charlemagne wasn't telling Ireland what to do, like he was telling Gaul and Germany, modern-day Gaul and Germany, what to do. Oh, come on back here. Oh, computer, oh, come on. All right, come back, hold on. Where'd it go? Oh, for heaven's sakes. Okay. Technology. They didn't have it in the 6th century in Ireland. Here's what to remember. Ireland had a long, gradual, gentle conversion process that went on for centuries. The conversion took place largely within a system of monasteries. Each monastery had its own abbot or abbess, its own rule, its own support, and of course, over time, in isolation from any higher authority, the liturgy would develop some quirks. I highlighted Brehon inheritance laws there because I want to talk about that. In the Gaelic civilization, there was no ownership. There was no primogeniture, and there was no private property. If St. Patrick or any other saint begged a local king, of which there were 150, for some land for a monastery, what happened when the king died? What would happen is that up to the 4th cousin, the family would get together, the Deravina it's called, get together and decide what to do with his property, what to do with what he left behind. Well, what probably happened a lot of times, and we can probably prove it too, is they'd say, well, that monastery is pretty good. They do good stuff. We can send our troublesome kids there, and they're teaching everybody how to read and write, and, they're improving, our farming style. So, yeah, let's keep them. Okay, and hey, why don't you go ahead and become you go ahead and become the abbot, and then your son can be the abbot after you. And so it went. Celibacy was not easily sold in Ireland, because in the view of the Irish, well, in the Old Testament, they were married, so why can't we be? Anyhow, and bear in mind what Rome was going through. The first 400 years, Rome was settling all the Christological debates. Was Mary the mother of God? Was Jesus true God and true man? All of that. The second 400 years, it was organizing Europe and civilizing Europe, the continental Europe. So Ireland was not high on their priority list. Now, which is not to say that Rome didn't know about Ireland. Rome did. The idea of the Celtic Church came from 2 Protestant scholars who wanted to make the case that, when we destroyed the Irish Church, we were really just connecting the Irish to their roots. And Archbishop James Ussher in 1639 was the first one to advocate this position, that the churches in the British Isles were distinct from Rome. Well, from what he saw, yeah, they were. 1881, Frederick Warren wrote that the history of the Celtic Church exhibits occasional proofs of its independence of and hostility to the claims of Rome. Yes, there were occasional signs of its independence from Rome, not necessarily hostility. Doctrinally, there were not disputes. Ireland did not have problems with the faith. Now, liturgy, yes, they didn't want to adopt the Roman rite. They had their own rite, and they loved it. And in 664, Rome tried at the Synod of Whitby to get all the Irish monasteries to agree to follow the Roman liturgy. And many of them did, but not Iona, which was at that point the intellectual leader. And so it wasn't really until 1172 at the Synod of Cashel that the Roman Rite of the day was definitively adopted. But doctrinally, it was never out of sync. Now, Frederick Warren probably didn't know about Palladius, because as soon as Rome knew that there were Christians in Ireland, 432, they sent to the Irish believing in Christ, Palladius, having been ordained by Pope Celestine, is sent as first bishop. So that was the year 431 or 432. Now, he came, he didn't last long, he didn't do much. Patrick came some point later, nobody knows when, but it was clear that Rome wanted to take care of the Christians who were there. But you got to remember, 432, Rome sends somebody to Ireland. 20 years later, Rome gets sacked by the Vandals and wasn't really in a really good position to follow up. So the independence that the Irish Church had from Rome was not malicious. It was not intentional. It was accident of lack of the internet. The liturgical diversity in Ireland was approved by Rome. Now, when St. Augustine was sent to Kent, that's nowadays Canterbury, in England, he found a diversity of liturgical practices because the Anglo-Saxons had been evangelized by the Irish monks. So they said Mass different from the way St. Augustine had been taught to say it in Rome. So he writes to Pope Gregory, and he says, what do I do? And here's what Gregory answered, and this is according to Bede. Choose from every individual church whatever things are devout, religious, and right. And when you have collected these, as it were, into one bundle, see that the minds of the English grow accustomed to it. In other words, he was tolerant of liturgical diversity. There's a delightful document that was not published until 1964, but was probably written in about 650, so that's like 1,300 years this thing was hidden and lost, by an Irish scribe in Northumbria, or Ireland. Northumbria is the northern part of Britain, just below Scotland. A palimpsest is a piece of vellum which has been scraped off and new text written on it. You know, it was scarce, so you had to reuse it. But you can still read what was underneath. And this sacramentary, they call it a sacramentary, has 158 fragments from 31 different masses. It has some amazing things in it. 2nd century Syriac prayers in Latin, a Syrian epiclesis. I mean, that gives you an idea of the kind of diversity that was going on in the daily, or weekly, I should say, liturgical practice in Ireland. Augustine tolerated local customs. At the Synod of Bangor, where he met with the bishops of England and Wales, he was bringing them in, he said, you know, if you will only do 3 things, celebrate Easter, baptize the way we tell you, and preach the word of God to the English people, we will tolerate all your customs, even though they're contrary to our own. So liturgical diversity was tolerated at that point in time. However, it didn't last forever. Another interesting 8th century thing. By the end of the 8th century, Rome was saying, okay, guys, this is the way it's going to be. We're going to say the liturgy this way. This is it. The other stuff has to be put aside. The Ratio de Cursus was written in the 8th century, but it wasn't translated until 1864 by an anonymous monk in which he defends the Cursus Scotorum, which was the Irish office and Mass liturgy, as being every bit as authentic as the liturgy from Rome. He says, you got it from Peter. Well, we got ours from St. Mark and St. John. You know, our liturgy is just as good as yours. And it was like the 8th century liturgy wars, which the Irish lost. Anyhow, so that's mile a minute. Did I answer the questions that I set out to answer? How did Christianity get to Ireland? Who brought it? Where did they come from? What evidence do we have? And was there a Celtic church? And now, who can tell me what's wrong with the picture? And you've seen it a million times, yes. The Roman vestments, exactly. They wouldn't have been wearing those in the 430s or 40s or 50s or whatever. What else is wrong? The different kind of vestments. much more like what they wear in the East nowadays. What? Byzantine type, yeah, probably. But the snakes, exactly. Ireland, the land mass of Ireland broke off from Europe in the last ice age. And so there never were snakes in Ireland. It's a charming story, and if by snakes you mean pagans or sinners, yes, give Patrick full credit. But there's something else in the picture that doesn't fit. Yes, it's the castle in the background. That is clearly a Norman or even a Hollywood type of castle. It looks kind of like Neuschwanstein. But no, it never looked like that. They never had towers like that. The Rock of Cashel was very different architecture. But anyhow, but it's lovely for pious purposes, and we all grew up with it, so not going to bother poor Patrick. There's a copy of the book. Anybody wants more information and elaboration on any of these points, happy to do it. Questions?
I might have missed it, but what made people go from Egypt to Ireland? They're so far
Well,
apart and different.
basically, all HE double hockey sticks was breaking out in Egypt. I mean, there were wars. I mean, people were arguing and would have street fights over whether Mary was the mother of God or the mother of Jesus. I mean, it was, people took it all very seriously. And Egypt was right in the epicenter of all that. And then when the Council of Nicaea finally said, okay, she's the mother of God, Jesus Christ was true God and true man, they said, well, now, I don't know, we don't go along with that. And then if you believed that Jesus Christ was true God and true man, you had to get out of Egypt or risk getting beaten up or killed. So things were tough, yes?
Were there religious refugees?
Religious refugees, that's the phrase, yes. Oh yeah, all the time. That was not interrupted. There was always trade. Between the Isles and the rest of Europe and the Mediterranean. The tin trade from Cornwall, which is the southwest corner of England and very close to Ireland, was the source of tin for the whole Roman Empire and beyond. And there's a charming legend in British Christianity, not English, but British Christianity, that there was a wealthy tin merchant named Joseph of Arimathea. And we know from Scripture that he was a wealthy man. And that he brought, on one of his journeys, he brought his nephew, a little boy named Jesus, on the trip with him. And that's part of the legend of British Christianity. It could be, who knows? But, anyhow. So there was always trade. And in the book, there's tons of evidences of that. And, shards of pottery and jewelry and everything. Lots and lots of trade all the time. And, of course, wine from Greece. And it was always coming to Ireland until, the British got into it. Yes?
How did Ireland transition from the oral tradition into the written tradition of copying manuscripts in the monasteries and texts like the alphabet of piety or the reception of the life of Saint Anthony in the East? How did Ireland transition from an oral tradition to a written?
Well, when the Druids converted, they had been the leaders and the thinkers and the intellectuals, so now they were Christians, and the monks had said, it's possible to write things down, and they said, oh yeah, let's do it. So the monks actually invented the Irish language, which is why it's so easy to learn, because it basically... Hush, students. Because it follows the basic rules that we're familiar with Latin, which very much influenced English grammar. They wrote the language and the script and all. So it was what the monks did, and they became the leaders of society. So what's neat is that the Christian monks in Ireland wanted to write down the pagan tales. Elsewhere in Europe, that didn't happen. those tales were lost, they were banned, those are evil, those are pagan, we're not going to listen to them, you can't hear them. But the Irish monks said, hey, truth is truth. We're not afraid of these stories of Finn McCool and all these, Cuchulainn and all these great characters. No, let's write them down. So they wrote them down. Now, there are some critics who say, well, they kind of sanitized them a little bit. Well, maybe they did, but they kept the stories. They may have cut out some of the blood and gore, but there's still plenty of it in them if you ever read those tales. Plenty of blood and gore. Yes?
Do we know how the Armenian traces ended up in Ireland?
No, we really don't. I mean, they're there to see, but we don't know. Well, except for our Bishop Keroui, who was an Armenian, who was a bishop in whatever place that was named. So he was there. How he got there? He probably hopped on a ship in Armenia and said, hey, I want to go east, go west. We don't know. There's no documentation of that. Maybe there is if you're an Armenian scholar, but I'm not.
Commonly accepted history has it that the Phoenicians had a maritime connection between Ireland and the Near East. Is it possible that this Hiberno-Coptic Irish connection was a continuation of that, a refinement of that?
Sure, very likely that was a continuation. No reason why it wouldn't be.
And that might even support your thesis, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a Barbary ape's head that was Navan is a town in Northern Ireland, and they not too long ago were digging it up to put in a highway, and they discovered a whole treasure trove of archaeological finds, including an ape's head, a Barbary ape's head from Africa that they carbon dated to like 183 years before Christ. So there had been a lot of trade and traffic, always.
Thanks so much.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you.